The Diablo universe didn't start with demons bursting through portals or angels wielding flaming swords. It started with something far stranger, a single cosmic entity tearing itself apart because it couldn't stand being alone anymore. Everything that follows, every battle, every corrupted soul, every fallen hero, traces back to that moment of cosmic loneliness. Welcome. Over the next few hours, you're going to hear the complete story of Diablo, from the beginning of creation to the end of everything. Gameplay footage will be running in the background while we walk through this, but you don't need to watch it. This is designed so you can listen while falling asleep, studying, or just relaxing. Most people won't make it to the end in one sitting, and that's completely fine. The lore will be here whenever you come back. We're not rushing through anything. Every part of this story gets the time it needs, so settle in however you're comfortable, and let's start at the absolute beginning, before there was heaven or hell, before angels or demons existed at all. In the beginning, there was Anu, just Anu, a single being of perfect unity, floating in an endless void. Anu was everything and nothing, order and chaos, light and dark, all contained within one consciousness. But here's the problem with being everything. You're also alone, completely, utterly alone. There's no one to talk to, no one to understand you, because there's literally nothing else in existence. Anu meditated on this for eons. Time didn't really mean anything yet, so who knows how long this actually took. But eventually Anu made a decision. To achieve true perfection, to become purely good and ordered, Anu needed to purge everything that wasn't perfect. All the darkness, all the chaos, all the evil that existed within this cosmic being needed to go. So Anu performed what can only be described as the most violent act of self-improvement in history. The being tore out every aspect of itself that represented evil, chaos, and darkness, and cast it away. This wasn't a gentle separation. This was cosmic surgery without anesthesia. The moment this happened, two beings came into existence where there had been one. Anu remained, now representing pure order, pure light, pure goodness. But the expelled essence didn't just disappear. It coalesced into its own entity. This became Tafemet, the first and greatest of all evils, a seven-headed dragon of absolute chaos and darkness. You'd think Anu would be happy now, right? Finally achieved that perfect purity. But Tafemet wasn't about to accept being cast aside like cosmic garbage. The dragon turned on its creator immediately, and the two beings clashed in a battle that makes every war that came after look like a playground scuffle. They fought for ages. When I say ages, I mean time periods so long, they're essentially meaningless to human comprehension. These weren't beings that got tired or needed breaks. They simply fought endlessly, each one trying to destroy the other. Anu wielded the power of creation and order. Tafemet commanded entropy and destruction. Neither could gain a permanent advantage. Then both of them died. The details of how exactly this happened are lost to time, but the result was catastrophic. When Anu and Tafemet killed each other, their deaths released so much energy that it created everything else. Their bodies, their essence, their power, all of it exploded outward and became the foundation of reality itself. From Anu's spine came the crystal arch, a massive structure of pure light and order. This arch became the foundation of the high heavens, a realm of gleaming silver and gold where angels would eventually be born. The crystal arch does something unique. It continuously generates angels, not through reproduction, but through spontaneous manifestation. Angels simply emerge from the arch, fully formed, each one a being of pure order and purpose. But Tafemet's death created something very different. The dragon's seven heads became seven distinct entities, each one embodying a different aspect of evil. These became the seven great evils, the most powerful demons in existence. Tafemet's body became the burning hells, a realm of fire and torment where demons would spawn endlessly. The largest part of Tafemet's corpse, the torso and main body, became something else entirely. This piece fell into the void between heaven and hell, and over time it cooled and solidified. Life began to grow on it. Forests emerged, oceans formed, civilizations rose. This became Sanctuary, the world where humans would eventually live. Yes, the entire mortal realm is built on the corpse of the greatest evil that ever existed, Keep that in mind because it explains a lot about why Sanctuary has such a complicated relationship with both angels and demons. So now we have three realms: the high heavens, shining and orderly, constantly producing angels; the burning hells, chaotic and tormenting, spawning demons without end; and Sanctuary, sitting between them, not yet inhabited by anything we'd recognize as human. The angels and demons didn't immediately go to war. First, they had to figure out what they even were. Angels emerged from the crystal arch with an innate understanding that they represented order, justice, and righteousness. They organized themselves into a hierarchy, with the most powerful angels becoming the Angiris Council, the ruling body of heaven. Demons clawed their way out of the burning hells with only one certainty: they existed to destroy, corrupt, and dominate. The seven great evils established themselves as the prime evils and lesser evils, ruling over countless lesser demons. The prime evils were three brothers, the strongest of Tephamet's seven heads: Diablo, the lord of terror; Mephisto, the lord of hatred; and Baal, the lord of destruction. Each one commanded legions of demons and wielded power that could reshape reality. The lesser evils were four: Asmodan, the lord of sin; Belial, the lord of lies; Andariel, the maiden of anguish; and Duriel, the lord of pain. Don't let the term lesser fool you. These beings could still annihilate armies and corrupt entire civilizations. They just weren't quite on the same level as the prime evils. Here's where things get interesting. You'd think the demons would be unified under the prime evil's leadership, all working together to spread evil. But demons are, by nature, chaotic and self-serving. The lesser evils resented being subordinate to the prime evils. They schemed and plotted, waiting for opportunities to seize more power for themselves. Meanwhile, the angels looked at the burning hells and recognized an existential threat. Demons represented everything angels opposed: chaos instead of order, destruction instead of creation, corruption instead of purity. War was inevitable. Thus began the eternal conflict. Not a war with a start date you could mark on a calendar, but an endless battle that has raged since the beginning of time itself. Angels and demons clashed across the void between their realms, fighting for dominance, for territory, for the very nature of existence. Neither side could win. Angels would push demons back, claiming ground, establishing fortresses in the void. Then demons would rally, overwhelming those positions, driving angels back toward heaven. The conflict was perfectly balanced, perfectly eternal, with neither side able to gain a lasting advantage. Generations of angels and demons were born, fought, and died in this war. Angels who fell in battle would eventually be reborn from the crystal arch, their memories and personalities intact. Demons who were destroyed would reform in the burning hells, crawling back into existence. Death meant little when both sides could resurrect their warriors. One angel stood out during this conflict. Imperius, the archangel of valor, was heaven's greatest warrior. He led the angelic hosts with absolute certainty in heaven's righteousness. To Imperius, the war was simple. Angels were good, demons were evil, and the fighting would continue until evil was eradicated. No compromise, no negotiation, just endless battle. But not all angels saw things so simply. Tyrell, the archangel of justice, fought alongside Imperius, but with growing doubt. He began questioning whether an eternal war with no end served any real purpose. Was heaven truly accomplishing anything, or just perpetuating endless violence? These doubts would become important later, much later. But for now, the eternal conflict ground on, consuming countless lives on both sides, achieving nothing except its own continuation. Then something changed, not in heaven or hell, but in Sanctuary, the world that both sides had largely ignored. Two beings, one angel and one demon, discovered each other there, and what they did next would alter the course of everything. The angel's name was Inarius. He was powerful, charismatic, and utterly exhausted by the eternal conflict. Thousands of years of fighting had worn away his faith in heaven's cause. He no longer believed the war could be won, and he no longer wanted to fight it. He dreamed of escape, of finding somewhere he could exist without constant battle. The demon's name was Lilith. She was the daughter of Mephisto, the lord of hatred, and she shared Inarius's weariness with the endless war. But Lilith's motivations were more complex than simple exhaustion. She saw the eternal conflict as limiting, a waste of potential. She wanted something more than endless fighting or the rigid hierarchy of hell. When Inarius and Lilith met in Sanctuary, they should have killed each other immediately. That's what angels and demons did, but instead they talked, and in talking they discovered something neither expected. They agreed with each other. Both wanted escape from the war. Both saw their respective sides as trapped in a pointless cycle. Both dreamed of something new. They became lovers. An angel and a demon, the two most opposed beings in existence, formed a relationship. And they weren't alone in their disillusionment. Inarius and Lilith reached out to others on both sides, angels and demons who were tired of fighting, who wanted escape. Slowly, carefully, they gathered followers, renegades who would abandon their sides in the eternal conflict. Inarius possessed something crucial, knowledge of how to hide Sanctuary from both heaven and hell. Using powerful magic, he created a barrier around the world, concealing it from detection. As long as they stayed within Sanctuary, neither the high heavens nor the burning hells would know they existed. The renegades fled to this hidden world, angels and demons living together in Sanctuary, creating a new society free from the eternal conflict. It should have been impossible, but somehow it worked. The shared experience of rejecting the war gave them common ground. They built communities, established peace, and for the first time in their existence knew something other than battle. Inarius and Lilith's relationship produced children. This shouldn't have been possible. Angels couldn't reproduce with demons. The two species were fundamentally incompatible, like trying to mix light and shadow, order and chaos. Yet their offspring existed, and they were something entirely new. These children were called the Nephilim. They weren't angels or demons, but something in between, possessing qualities of both. They had physical forms like demons, but could channel power like angels. They were mortal, capable of dying permanently, yet stronger than either of their parent races. Other renegades began having children as well, creating more Nephilim. These beings grew rapidly, not just in number but in power. Each generation seemed stronger than the last. The Nephilim possessed potential that neither angels nor demons had ever displayed. This is where Inarius and Lilith's visions diverged. Inarius looked at the Nephilim and saw a threat. They were growing too powerful, too quickly. If heaven or hell ever discovered Sanctuary, these powerful beings would draw attention. Inarius wanted peace and safety, which meant keeping Sanctuary hidden at all costs. The Nephilim's power endangered that goal. Lilith saw something different. She looked at the Nephilim and saw potential beyond anything the eternal conflict could produce. These beings could grow stronger than angels or demons. With proper guidance, they could become a force capable of ending the war permanently, not through peace, but through dominance. Lilith dreamed of an army of Nephilim conquering both heaven and hell, creating a new order with herself and Inarius as its rulers. The two argued about this constantly. Inarius insisted on limiting the Nephilim's power, keeping them weak enough to avoid detection. Lilith refused, believing that suppressing the Nephilim was a waste of their incredible potential. The argument came to a head when Inarius made a decision. Using the world's stone, a powerful artifact he'd hidden in Sanctuary, he began suppressing the Nephilim's powers. Slowly, over generations, the Nephilim would become weaker, more limited, more human. They would retain their mortal forms and their ability to reproduce, but the godlike power they'd once possessed would fade. Lilith was furious. She saw this as betrayal, as Inarius destroying everything the Nephilim could become. In her rage, she did something extreme. She began killing the other renegades, both angels and demons, believing they supported Inarius's decision. Her own allies, the beings she'd convinced to flee to Sanctuary, fell to her fury. Inarius stopped her, but he couldn't bring himself to kill her. Despite everything, despite her betrayal and violence, he still loved her. So instead, he banished Lilith to the void, a realm of nothingness where she would be trapped forever, unable to return to Sanctuary, unable to interfere with his plans. With Lilith gone and the other renegades mostly dead, Inarius became the sole ruler of Sanctuary. He continued his work with the World Stone, gradually weakening the Nephilim over generations, The beings who had once been capable of challenging angels and demons became something far less powerful. They became humanity as we know it. But Inarius made a mistake. He assumed that by suppressing the Nephilim's power, he was eliminating it. He didn't realize he was just hiding it, burying it deep within humanity's bloodline. The potential remained, dormant, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Human civilization grew on Sanctuary. Kingdoms rose and fell. People lived and died, unaware of their true origins, unaware that they carried within them the potential for power beyond imagination. Inarius watched over them, still using the World Stone to maintain the barrier that hid Sanctuary from heaven and hell. For a time it seemed like Inarius had succeeded. Sanctuary remained hidden. Humanity remained weak. The eternal conflict continued in the void between heaven and hell, but Sanctuary stayed untouched, a peaceful world removed from the war. This peace lasted for centuries, but nothing stays hidden forever. And when heaven and hell finally discovered Sanctuary, when they learned about humanity's existence and their Nephilim origins, it would trigger a crisis that threatened to destroy everything. The discovery of Sanctuary didn't happen all at once. It started with whispers, rumors, fragments of information that made their way back to both heaven and hell. Angels and demons who had served with the renegades began noticing something strange. Their former comrades had vanished completely. No trace in heaven, no presence in hell, no evidence of death in the eternal conflict. It was as if they'd simply ceased to exist. At first, neither side paid much attention. The war demanded focus. Angels and demons died and were reborn constantly. A few missing soldiers seemed insignificant compared to the endless battles being fought. But as more time passed, as the number of missing beings grew, questions started being asked. Where had they gone? How had they disappeared so completely? A demon named Lilitu eventually pieced together enough information to realize what had happened. The renegades hadn't died. They'd fled somewhere, created a refuge hidden from both heaven and hell. Lilitu brought this information to Mephisto, one of the three prime evils ruling hell at the time. Mephisto immediately understood the implications. If renegades had created a hidden realm, they might be building an army there, preparing to strike at both heaven and hell simultaneously. Mephisto shared this information with his brothers, Diablo and Baal. The three prime evils agreed this needed investigation. They began searching for this hidden realm, using their vast powers to probe the spaces between worlds, looking for any trace of where the renegades might have fled. In heaven, similar discoveries were being made. Angels loyal to the Anguirus Council reported the same pattern of disappearances. Tyrael, the Archangel of Justice, took particular interest in this mystery. Unlike some of his fellow archangels, Tyrael believed in pursuing truth regardless of where it led. He coordinated heaven's search for the hidden realm. It took time, but eventually both sides found it. Sanctuary had been hidden well, protected by the World Stone's power and Inarius's careful maintenance of barriers between worlds. But no secret lasts forever. When you're hiding from beings of infinite patience and vast power, eventually they find what they're looking for. Hell found it first. A demon scout managed to pierce through the barriers surrounding Sanctuary, getting just close enough to sense what lay beyond. What he discovered shocked Hell's leadership. The hidden realm wasn't just a refuge. It contained beings unlike anything they'd encountered before. Beings that radiated both angelic and demonic power, fused into something entirely new. Mephisto understood immediately. The renegades hadn't just fled. They'd bred. Angels and demons had created offspring, produced a new race of beings that combined the strengths of both. This was unprecedented. Angels and demons had fought each other since creation, but they'd never produced children together. The existence of such beings changed everything. Hell's initial reaction was to invade immediately. Destroy Sanctuary, kill every Nephilim, eliminate this potential threat before it could grow stronger. But Mephisto proposed a different approach. These Nephilim, if they could be corrupted, might serve Hell's purposes. A race of beings with both angelic and demonic heritage, twisted to serve the forces of darkness, could tip the balance of the eternal conflict decisively in Hell's favor. Heaven discovered Sanctuary shortly after. Their reaction was more conflicted. Some angels, particularly those on the Anguirus Council, viewed the Nephilim as abominations that needed to be destroyed immediately. The mixing of angelic and demonic essence violated fundamental laws. These beings shouldn't exist. But Tyrael disagreed. He argued that the Nephilim weren't responsible for their creation. They hadn't chosen to be born from angel and demon parents. Destroying them for simply existing seemed unjust. He proposed that heaven should study the Nephilim first, understand what they were, before making any decisions about their fate. The Angiris Council debated for what seemed like ages in mortal terms. Imperius, the Archangel of Valor and leader of the Council, wanted immediate action. He viewed the Nephilim as a threat to heaven's purity, a corruption that needed cleansing. Oriel, the Archangel of Hope, sided with Tyrael, arguing that the Nephilim might represent an opportunity rather than just a threat. Malthael, the Archangel of Wisdom, remained characteristically silent, observing and contemplating. Ithrael, the Archangel of Fate, studied the threads of destiny surrounding Sanctuary, trying to understand what role these new beings might play in the larger cosmic plan. While heaven debated and hell schemed, Inarius remained unaware of the danger. The World Stone's barriers still held. He continued his work, further weakening the Nephilim with each passing generation, turning them into something more manageable. In his mind, everything was proceeding according to plan. Sanctuary would remain hidden indefinitely, and he would rule over a peaceful realm far from the war. Then the barriers fell. It's unclear exactly what caused it. Maybe the World Stone's power finally weakened after maintaining such extensive barriers for so long. Maybe the combined probing from both heaven and hell eventually found a weak point. Or maybe it was simple inevitability. Secrets this large can't stay hidden forever. When the barriers dropped, both heaven and hell gained full awareness of Sanctuary's existence and its inhabitants. The Nephilim were exposed, their existence revealed to both sides of the eternal conflict, and both sides immediately began planning how to deal with this unexpected development. Inarius panicked. His perfect hidden sanctuary was no longer hidden. Everything he'd built, everything he'd sacrificed for, was now under threat from the very forces he'd fled. He knew both heaven and hell would have strong opinions about Sanctuary's existence. Neither would simply ignore it. He tried to restore the barriers, to hide Sanctuary again, but it was too late. The damage was done. Both sides knew where Sanctuary was located and what it contained. Hiding was no longer an option. What happened next became known as the Sin War, though that name would only be applied much later, after everything had already played out. Both heaven and hell sent agents to Sanctuary. Not armies, not yet. Both sides wanted to understand the Nephilim better before committing to full-scale invasion. They needed to know if these beings were threats or potential assets. The agents from both sides worked subtly at first. They observed human civilization, studied how the weakened Nephilim lived their lives, assessed their capabilities. What they found was complicated. The Nephilim had been significantly weakened by Inarius's use of the World Stone. They no longer possessed the godlike powers of their ancestors, but they retained something interesting: potential. The power wasn't gone, just dormant. Under the right circumstances, with the right catalyst, a Nephilim could potentially awaken that buried strength. This discovery changed the calculus for both sides. If the Nephilim were permanently weak, they'd be insignificant, not worth the effort of invasion or corruption. But if their power could be awakened, if they could be made strong again, then they became incredibly valuable. A race of powerful beings with no inherent loyalty to either heaven or hell could tip the balance of the eternal conflict dramatically. Both sides began competing for influence over humanity. Demons worked to corrupt them, to awaken their power through promises of strength and freedom from heaven's rules. Angels worked to guide them toward righteousness, to awaken their power through faith and devotion to heaven's cause. Neither side told humanity the truth about their origins or their potential. Both simply manipulated from the shadows, trying to steer human civilization in directions that would benefit their respective causes. Inarius watched this happening with growing horror. His sanctuary was becoming a battlefield, not through direct warfare, but through manipulation and influence. Heaven and hell were fighting over humanity's souls, trying to claim the Nephilim for their own purposes. Everything he'd tried to prevent was happening anyway. He made a desperate decision. He would try to end this before it escalated further. He would negotiate with both heaven and hell, convince them to leave Sanctuary alone. It was a naive plan, but Inarius had spent so long isolated in his sanctuary that he'd forgotten how the politics of the eternal conflict actually worked. Heaven and hell didn't make deals that didn't serve their interests. They didn't respect neutrality. They viewed everything through the lens of the war, and sanctuary represented a potential advantage neither side would willingly give up. Inarius's negotiations went poorly. Heaven refused to acknowledge his authority over sanctuary. As far as the Angiris Council was concerned, he was a deserter who had abandoned his post. His opinions about sanctuary's fate were irrelevant. Hell simply laughed at his attempts at diplomacy. Mephisto in particular enjoyed toying with Inarius, making promises he had no intention of keeping, watching the fallen angel squirm. During these failed negotiations, something else was happening on Sanctuary itself. A human was beginning to awaken. Not fully, not to the extent of the original Nephilim, but enough to draw attention. This human demonstrated abilities that shouldn't have been possible for the weakened Nephilim. They could sense demons and angels, could fight them on relatively equal footing, displayed strength far beyond what Inarius's dampening should have allowed. This awakening terrified Inarius. If one Nephilim could awaken their dormant power, others might as well. The weakening he'd imposed might not be as permanent as he'd believed. Humanity might be able to reclaim their heritage, become the powerful beings their ancestors had been. That would make Sanctuary even more valuable to both heaven and hell, escalating the conflict even further. He also faced another problem. Lilith had returned. Somehow she'd escaped from the void where he'd banished her. The exact method of her escape remains unclear, but she was back on Sanctuary, and she immediately began working toward her original goal. She wanted to awaken humanity's power, to restore the Nephilim to their full strength, to create the army she'd always envisioned. Lilith moved through human civilization, like a serpent through grass, subtle and dangerous. She whispered to those humans who showed potential, guided them toward awakening their dormant power, taught them techniques for accessing the strength that Inarius had tried to bury. She was careful, working slowly enough that Inarius wouldn't immediately notice her influence, but steadily enough that her work would be difficult to undo. The situation on Sanctuary spiraled into chaos. Heaven and hell competed for influence. Inarius tried desperately to maintain control. Lilith worked to awaken humanity's power, and caught in the middle were ordinary humans, most of whom had no idea what was really happening, who didn't understand that angels and demons walked among them, that their very existence was the subject of a cosmic debate. This was the state of Sanctuary when the Sin War truly began, not with armies clashing, but with manipulation, awakening, and the slow realization that humanity wasn't just a curiosity or a potential resource. They were players in the eternal conflict now, whether they wanted to be or not. Their choices would matter. Their power, once fully awakened, could change everything. The first human to truly awaken was named Odyssean. He didn't look like someone destined to change the world. He was a farmer, living in a small village, concerned with crops and seasons and the simple rhythms of rural life. But something inside him was different, something that had been dormant for generations. Lilith found him. She didn't introduce herself as the mother of the Nephilim or reveal her true nature. Instead, she appeared as Lilia, a mysterious woman who took interest in Odyssean and his brother Mendorn. She recognized what he was, what he could become. She saw in him the potential she'd been searching for, the proof that humanity could reclaim their power. Odyssean had no idea what was happening to him at first. Strange things occurred around him. He could sense things others couldn't, felt connections to the world that defied explanation. When danger threatened, his body responded with strength and speed that shouldn't have been possible. These manifestations were small initially, easily dismissed as luck or adrenaline, but they grew stronger. Lilith guided him carefully. She didn't force the awakening but facilitated it, created situations where his power would manifest naturally. She was patient in a way that contradicted everything demons were supposed to be. This was her children, her creation, and she treated their awakening with genuine care. Whatever else Lilith was, whatever horrors she'd committed, her love for the Nephilim was real. Meanwhile, both heaven and hell noticed the awakening. They couldn't ignore it. A Nephilim beginning to access their true power was exactly what both sides had feared and desired. He represented opportunity and threat simultaneously. The Cathedral of Light arrived in Odyssean's region first. This was a religious organization that claimed to serve heaven, that preached about the glory of the angels and the righteousness of the high heavens. Their priests performed miracles, healed the sick, drove out demons. To ordinary humans, they seemed like saviors, proof that heaven cared about Sanctuary's people. But the cathedral had a darker side. They were manipulated by heaven, specifically by certain members of the Anguirus Council, who believed humanity should serve angelic interests. The cathedral's leadership didn't know they were being used. They genuinely believed they were doing good, spreading light and fighting evil. That made them more effective tools than if they'd been knowingly corrupt. The Triune appeared shortly after. This was Hell's answer to the cathedral, though it was far more subtle in its approach. The Triune claimed to worship three divine spirits, presented themselves as an alternative to the cathedral's rigid doctrines. They offered power to their followers, taught techniques that seemed like magic, but were actually demonic corruption disguised as enlightenment. The Triune was directly controlled by the primevals. Mephisto, Diablo, and Baal had orchestrated its creation, using it to spread their influence across Sanctuary while appearing benevolent. The Triune's followers had no idea they were serving hell. They thought they'd found a path to spiritual power and fulfillment. These two organizations began competing for control of Sanctuary's human population. They didn't fight openly, not at first. Instead, they competed for converts, for influence, for political power. The cathedral and the Triune both claimed to offer salvation, both promised protection from the dangers of the world, both demanded loyalty and obedience. Caught between them were ordinary humans who didn't understand what was really happening. They saw two religious organizations, both performing miracles, both claiming to represent truth. Most chose one side or the other based on practical concerns. Which group offered more immediate benefits, which had more political power in their region, which aligned better with their existing beliefs. Odyssean wanted nothing to do with either group. He saw the cathedral's rigidity and the Triune's manipulative tactics. Something about both organizations felt wrong to him, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. His awakening power gave him perception others lacked. He could sense the angelic influence behind the cathedral, the demonic taint within the Triune. Lilith encouraged his skepticism. She wanted him independent, wanted him to discover his power without being controlled by either heaven or hell. This was crucial to her plan. If Odyssean was going to awaken other Nephilim, if he was going to lead humanity to reclaim their heritage, he needed to be free from outside manipulation. But Inarius had noticed Odyssean too. The father of Sanctuary, still desperate to maintain control, saw the awakening as a threat to everything he'd built. He'd spent millennia trying to weaken humanity, trying to make them insignificant enough that neither heaven nor hell would care about them. Now this farmer was undoing centuries of work, accessing power that should have remained buried forever. Inarius made a decision that would define the coming conflict. He would personally intervene. He'd remained hidden for so long, ruling Sanctuary from the shadows through intermediaries and subtle manipulation. But this situation demanded direct action. He couldn't allow the Nephilim to fully awaken. He began moving pieces into position. The Cathedral of Light was already under his influence. He'd been guiding it for years, using it to spread worship of heaven and suppress anything that threatened the status quo. Now he directed the cathedral to focus specifically on Odyssean, to either convert him or eliminate him. The cathedral's priests arrived in Odyssean's village with an offer. Join them. Use his obvious power in service of heaven. Become a holy warrior fighting against the darkness. They presented this as the righteous path, the only acceptable use of the abilities he'd manifested. Odyssean refused. Something about their certainty, their absolute conviction that they knew the right path, repelled him. He'd seen too much rigidity in the cathedral's methods, too much willingness to condemn anyone who disagreed with their doctrine. He didn't trust them. The cathedral's response was swift and brutal. If Odyssean wouldn't serve them, he was an enemy. They declared him a heretic, a danger to Sanctuary, someone who'd been corrupted by demonic influence. They mobilized their forces to capture or kill him. The Triune saw an opportunity. They approached Odyssean with a different offer. Join them instead. They claimed to be more flexible than the cathedral, more understanding of individual paths to power. They promised freedom and knowledge, the chance to explore his abilities without judgment. Odyssean saw through this manipulation too. The Triune's promises were honeyed poison. He could sense something wrong beneath their words, something that felt fundamentally corrupt. He refused them as well. This left Odyssean in an impossible position. Both major power structures on Sanctuary wanted to control or destroy him. He was a farmer with growing abilities he didn't fully understand, facing organizations with vast resources and political influence. He should have been crushed immediately. But something unexpected happened. Other humans began awakening around him. His brother Mendel developed his own abilities, different from Odyssean's but equally powerful. Others in their village and surrounding regions started manifesting Nephilim powers. Odyssean's awakening was triggering others, creating a cascade effect that Inarius had always feared. These awakening humans were confused and frightened. Their powers manifested unpredictably. They could do things that seemed impossible, but they had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. The cathedral declared them heretics. The Triune tried to recruit them. Most just wanted to understand what they were becoming. Odyssean became their leader by necessity rather than choice. He didn't seek power or authority, but these awakening Nephilim needed guidance, needed someone who understood what they were experiencing. He'd awakened first, had more control over his abilities, and most importantly, he'd rejected both the cathedral and the Triune. That independence made him trustworthy in a way that no other leader could be. What formed around Odyssean wasn't an organization or a formal movement. It was more organic than that. Awakening Nephilim gravitated toward him, seeking answers and protection. They learned from each other, discovered their abilities together, developed techniques for controlling their power through trial and error. This terrified everyone else. Heaven saw an army of Nephilim forming outside their control. Hell saw the same thing. Inarius saw his worst nightmare manifesting. Even Lilith, who'd started this process, began to worry that events were moving too fast, that the awakening was happening too chaotically. The situation escalated rapidly. The Cathedral of Light declared open war on Odyssean and his followers. They mobilized armies, recruited human warriors who believed they were fighting demons and heretics. They had angelic support, though most Cathedral members didn't realize it. Angels walked among them disguised as humans, providing guidance and power. The Triune responded by intensifying their own recruitment efforts. They offered immediate power to anyone who joined them, using demonic magic to create instant warriors. These converts didn't realize they were being corrupted, thought they'd found a legitimate path to strength. The Triune's armies grew rapidly, filled with humans who had no idea they were serving hell. Odyssean found himself leading a faction in what historians would call the Sin War. It wasn't a war he wanted, wasn't a conflict he'd chosen, but he had no choice. The Cathedral and the Triune both wanted to destroy or control his followers. The only option was to fight back. The battles that followed revealed something crucial about the awakening Nephilim. They were powerful, far more powerful than Inarius's dampening should have allowed. When they fully accessed their abilities, they could fight angels and demons on equal footing. A fully awakened Nephilim wasn't just strong, they were potentially stronger than the beings who'd created them. This changed everything. Heaven and hell had viewed humanity as weak, as pawns to be manipulated. The Nephilim had been theoretical threats, ancient history, something that Inarius had supposedly neutralized. But watching awakened humans fight their warriors, watching farmers and merchants manifest power that rivaled celestial beings, both sides realized they'd underestimated humanity. Inarius watched these battles with growing horror. Every fight proved that his dampening had failed. The Nephilim were waking up, reclaiming the power that was their birthright. If this continued, if more humans awakened, Sanctuary would become exactly what he'd tried to prevent. A realm of beings powerful enough to challenge both heaven and hell, unpredictable and impossible to control. He made a decision that would define his legacy. He couldn't stop the awakening through subtle means. The time for manipulation and dampening had passed. If he was going to preserve his vision of Sanctuary, if he was going to keep humanity weak and irrelevant, he needed to act directly and decisively. Inarius revealed himself, not to everyone, not in some grand announcement, but to key figures in the conflict. He made his presence known. He was still the most powerful being on Sanctuary, still an angel who'd helped create this realm. His power dwarfed even the awakening Nephilim. He directed the cathedral with new intensity, gave them strategies and tools for fighting the awakening humans. He provided them with weapons designed specifically to counter Nephilim abilities, taught them techniques for suppressing the power that was manifesting in their enemies. The cathedral became more effective, more dangerous. But Inarius made a crucial mistake. He assumed that his power and his authority would be enough to crush the awakening. He'd spent so long as Sanctuary's hidden ruler that he'd forgotten what the original Nephilim had been capable of. He'd forgotten that his children, when they reached their full potential, had been strong enough to threaten both heaven and hell. Odyssean continued to grow stronger. Each battle, each challenge pushed him further toward his full potential. Lilith guided him when she could, though she had to remain hidden. She knew that if Inarius discovered she'd returned, he'd focus all his energy on destroying her before dealing with anything else. The Sin War intensified, drawing more combatants, consuming more of Sanctuary. Human civilization teetered on the edge of collapse as three factions fought for control, and beneath it all, the question remained. What were humans supposed to be? What was Sanctuary's purpose? Who had the right to decide humanity's fate? The answers came faster than anyone expected. Odyssean's power reached a level that couldn't be ignored anymore. He wasn't just stronger than other awakened Nephilim. He was approaching something that hadn't existed in thousands of years, the full strength of the original children of angels and demons, before Inarius had dampened them, before they'd been reduced to mere humans, and Inarius finally understood what that meant. He'd spent centuries believing his dampening was permanent, that he'd successfully reduced the Nephilim to something manageable, but the truth was simpler and more terrifying. He hadn't eliminated their power, he'd just hidden it, buried it so deep that most humans would never find it. Odyssean had found it anyway. The confrontation between them was inevitable. Inarius couldn't allow a being of that power to exist on Sanctuary, not when that being rejected his vision for humanity. And Odyssean couldn't accept Inarius's plan to keep humanity weak and ignorant forever. They met on a battlefield already soaked with blood from the Sin War. Inarius appeared in his full angelic form, radiant and terrible, every inch the mighty being who'd helped create Sanctuary. He expected Odyssean to submit, to recognize the vast difference in their experience and wisdom. Odyssean attacked instead. The battle that followed shook Sanctuary to its foundations, literally. The landscape warped and cracked under the force of their conflict. Mountains crumbled, rivers changed course, the sky itself seemed to fracture. Inarius was stronger. He had millennia of experience, perfect control over his abilities, knowledge of techniques that Odyssean couldn't match. But Odyssean had something Inarius didn't, raw potential that was still growing, still expanding toward heights that the original Nephilim had reached. They fought across Sanctuary, their battle consuming everything around them. The armies of the cathedral and the triune scattered, unable to survive the collateral damage. Towns were destroyed just from the shockwaves. Forests burned. The very air crackled with released power. And slowly, impossibly, Odyssean began to match him. Each moment of the fight pushed Odyssean closer to his full strength. His attacks grew more powerful, his defenses more absolute. The gap between them shrank with every exchange until they were truly fighting as equals. Inarius realized with growing horror that he might actually lose. This shouldn't have been possible. Odyssean was mortal, barely trained, operating on instinct more than technique. But the power of the Nephilim, once fully awakened, made technique almost irrelevant. It was pure force. The combined might of angel and demon merged into something that transcended both. The battle reached a stalemate. Neither could deliver a finishing blow. Inarius couldn't overcome Odyssean's growing power. Odyssean couldn't match Inarius's skill and experience. And that's when the others arrived. Heaven and hell had been watching the Sin War with increasing alarm. The conflict was exposing Sanctuary's existence to more and more of their forces. The awakening Nephilim represented a threat both sides had thought neutralized. And now, Inarius, the angel who'd supposedly solved the Nephilim problem, was locked in a stalemate with a human farmer. They intervened, not to help either side, but to contain the entire situation. The Anguirus Council descended from heaven. Tyrael, Imperius, and the others, the leaders of the angelic host. From hell came the prime evils themselves, Mephisto, Diablo, and Baal, manifesting in forms that could exist on Sanctuary. Both sides wanted the same thing, to prevent Sanctuary from becoming a realm of fully awakened Nephilim who could challenge their authority. They didn't agree on much, but they agreed on this. The Nephilim had to remain weak. Seeing angels and demons working together, even temporarily, shocked everyone on Sanctuary. These were beings who'd fought the eternal conflict for longer than human civilization had existed. Their hatred for each other defined reality itself. Yet here they were, united against a common threat: humanity. Odyssean, exhausted from his battle with Inarius, faced this combined force. Every angel and demon who'd come to Sanctuary focused on him as the greatest threat, the one who'd awakened most fully. He should have died instantly. Even at full strength, one Nephilim couldn't fight the leadership of both heaven and hell simultaneously. But something unexpected happened. Other awakened humans felt Odyssean's danger through whatever connection they shared. They came to his aid, manifesting across the battlefield. Not just the ones who joined his cause, but awakened Nephilim from all factions. Some had been cathedral, some triune, some neutral. In that moment, facing the combined might of their creators, they recognized what they truly were. Not angels or demons, not pawns in someone else's war. Nephilim, children of Sanctuary, something new. The battle that followed made the fight between Odyssean and Inarius look like a skirmish. This was a war for Sanctuary's very existence, for humanity's right to determine its own fate. The awakened Nephilim fought with desperation and fury. They were defending their home, their freedom, their right to be more than what heaven and hell wanted them to be, and they were winning. The primevals, ancient and powerful, found themselves pushed back by these hybrid beings. The Anguirus Council, used to facing demons in the eternal conflict, struggled against enemies who combined angelic and demonic abilities in ways they'd never encountered. For the first time since the eternal conflict began, heaven and hell faced defeat, not from each other, but from something they'd created and then tried to suppress. It was Tyrael who changed everything. The Archangel of Justice had been watching the battle with growing understanding. He'd come to Sanctuary believing the Nephilim were a threat that needed to be contained. But watching them fight for their freedom, seeing the courage and determination they displayed, he began to question everything. Were the Nephilim really a threat, or were they exactly what they appeared to be? People fighting for their right to exist as they were meant to exist. Justice demanded recognition of that right, even if it meant opposing his fellow angels. Tyrael did something unprecedented. He sided with humanity against his own kind. His power turned the tide completely. The combined forces of heaven and hell, already struggling against the Nephilim, couldn't maintain their assault with an archangel fighting against them. The battle ended not with a clear victory, but with a stalemate that forced negotiation. The terms that emerged from those negotiations would define Sanctuary's future forever. They became known as the Binding, a set of agreements that all parties had to accept. First, Sanctuary would remain hidden from both heaven and hell. Its location would be secret, protected by wards that even the prime evils and Anguirus Council couldn't easily penetrate. This protected humanity from direct interference. Second, angels and demons would be forbidden from manifesting on Sanctuary in their full power. They could influence events through mortal agents, through manipulation and subtle interference. But no more direct invasions, no more armies marching across human lands. Third, and most importantly, the Nephilim would be dampened again, but not through Inarius's method. This time it would be a natural dampening, worked into the fabric of Sanctuary itself. Each generation of humans would be born weaker than their parents. The awakened power would fade slowly but inevitably until humanity was reduced to something manageable. The Nephilim who'd fought in the Sin War were allowed to keep their power for the remainder of their lives, but their children would be lesser, and their grandchildren lesser still. Eventually, humans would be weak enough that heaven and hell would stop viewing them as threats. Odyssean agreed to these terms. He didn't have much choice. The alternative was the complete destruction of Sanctuary, either by heaven and hell working together, or by their continued conflict tearing the realm apart. But he made sure that knowledge survived. The awakened Nephilim recorded their history, their understanding of what they were. They created texts and teachings that would be passed down through generations. Someday, they hoped, their descendants might rediscover what they'd been, might awaken again. The final part of the binding addressed Inarius himself. He'd created Sanctuary to escape the eternal conflict, but his actions had nearly destroyed it. His attempt to control humanity, to keep them weak and worshipful, had sparked the sin war that exposed Sanctuary to both heaven and hell. The Angiris Council and the Primevals agreed on his punishment. Inarius would be taken to hell, imprisoned in a realm of eternal torment, not killed because killing an angel was nearly impossible, but removed from Sanctuary forever, unable to interfere with humanity again. His screams would echo through hell for thousands of years, a reminder of what happened to those who tried to defy both heaven and hell simultaneously. Lilith's fate was similar but different. She'd sparked the awakening, guided Odyssean, tried to create a realm ruled by powerful Nephilim. Her vision had been as controlling as Inarius's, just in a different direction. She was imprisoned as well, sealed away in a void between realms where she could influence nothing, or so everyone thought. The Sin War ended. The surviving Nephilim dispersed across Sanctuary, living out their remaining years with the knowledge that their children would be weaker than them, that the power they'd fought so hard to awaken would be lost again. Odyssean himself faced a choice. He could keep his power, live for centuries as one of the last true Nephilim, or he could sacrifice himself to strengthen the wards, protecting Sanctuary, ensuring that humanity would have time to develop without interference. He chose sacrifice, not because he was forced to, but because he'd seen what happened when powerful beings tried to control humanity. He wouldn't become another Inarius, another immortal ruler deciding humanity's fate. His power merged with Sanctuary's foundations, strengthening the barriers that kept it hidden, and in doing so, he ensured that humanity would have centuries to develop on its own terms. The generations that followed the Sin War knew peace, relative peace anyway. Sanctuary was still a dangerous place, full of monsters and demons that had been trapped there when the wards went up, but there were no more invasions from heaven or hell, no more wars between angels and demons fought on human soil. Humanity built civilizations, they developed cultures, technologies, forms of magic adapted to their diminishing power. The great nations that would exist in Diablo's time began to take shape. Westmarch, Kandurus, Kyrgyzstan, all of them rose from the ashes of the Sin War. But the dampening worked exactly as designed. Each generation was weaker than the last. The incredible powers that Odyssean and his fellow Nephilim had wielded became legends, then myths, then forgotten stories. Humans forgot what they'd been, forgot that they were descended from beings who could challenge gods. The texts and teachings that the awakened Nephilim had created were lost or destroyed, some deliberately by those who feared what might happen if humanity remembered its true nature. Others simply faded with time, victims of war and decay. By the time of Diablo's invasion, humanity had been reduced to exactly what Inarius had originally wanted: weak, mortal, ignorant of their true potential. They could still grow stronger through training and discipline. Some became powerful warriors or mages, but nothing approaching what their ancestors had been. The binding had achieved its purpose. Humanity was no longer a threat to heaven or hell. But the binding had limits. It prevented direct interference, but it didn't eliminate the eternal conflict. Heaven and hell still fought their war, and Sanctuary still existed between them. The wards could weaken, the agreements could be tested, and some beings never stopped trying to break them. The Angiris Council knew something was wrong. They'd been too focused on their eternal war with hell to notice at first. But as centuries passed after the binding, reports filtered back. Sanctuary existed. It was hidden, but not perfectly. Angels passing near its location felt something, a disturbance, a place that shouldn't exist. Imperius, Archangel of Valor, wanted to destroy it immediately. In his view, Sanctuary was an abomination, a realm created by traitors, populated by demonic offspring. The fact that these Nephilim had angel blood too didn't matter to him. They were tainted, corrupted, a threat to heaven's purity. Tyrael, Archangel of Justice, disagreed. He'd investigated Sanctuary more thoroughly than the others. He'd observed humanity from a distance, seen how they'd developed. They weren't demons, they weren't angels either. They were something new, something that deserved a chance to prove what they could become. The debate within the council was fierce. Imperius demanded action. Malthael, archangel of wisdom, remained silent, studying the problem from every angle. Auriel, archangel of hope, sided with Tirael, seeing potential in humanity. Ithrael, archangel of fate, was uncertain. The threads of destiny surrounding Sanctuary were tangled, unclear. Eventually, Tirael's position won out, but not because he convinced everyone, rather because the binding made the issue moot. Heaven couldn't simply invade Sanctuary without violating the agreement that had ended the Sin War. Breaking that agreement would restart the conflict between heaven and hell, with Sanctuary as the battleground. Even Imperius saw the tactical problem with that. Hell faced similar debates. The primevals had lost track of Sanctuary when Inarius first created it. They'd been too focused on fighting each other in heaven, but eventually they became aware of it, and when they did, they saw opportunity. The three brothers, Diablo, Mephisto, and Baal, understood something crucial about Sanctuary. It wasn't just a hidden realm, it was a potential weapon. If they could corrupt humanity, turn them toward darkness, they'd have an army that could bypass the binding. Humans weren't bound by the same rules as demons. They could act where demons couldn't. But corrupting humanity wouldn't be simple. The binding prevented direct demonic invasion. The wards around Sanctuary were strong, and humanity, weakened as they were, still possessed fragments of Nephilim power. They could resist demonic influence if they chose to. The primevals needed a different approach. They needed agents, cultists who would worship them willingly, magic users who would tap into demonic power in exchange for strength. And they needed time, centuries to slowly spread their influence, to plant seeds that would grow into full corruption. The cult of the Free emerged gradually. It started with isolated groups, madmen and outcasts who claimed to hear voices from beyond. Most were dismissed as lunatics, but some of what they said was true. They did hear voices, the prime evils reaching across the veil, whispering promises of power. These early cultists didn't understand what they were serving. They thought they'd discovered ancient secrets, hidden knowledge that would elevate them. They performed rituals without knowing the full consequences. They summoned lesser demons thinking they were spirits or elementals. They spread the cult's teachings, believing they were enlightening others. The Zakharum Church was different. It began as a legitimate faith, founded by a prophet named Akarat, who genuinely wanted to help humanity. Akarat preached compassion, discipline, inner strength. His teaching spread across the eastern kingdoms, particularly in Kyrgyzstan. For generations, the Zakharum were a force for good. But institutions are easier to corrupt than individuals. Mephisto, Lord of Hatred, saw the Zakharum's potential. A massive, organized religion with influence across multiple kingdoms. If he could corrupt it from within, he'd have the perfect tool for spreading demonic influence, while maintaining a facade of righteousness. The corruption was subtle. It took centuries. A whisper here, a compromised priest there. Mephisto worked through dreams and visions, appearing as divine revelation. He twisted the church's teachings incrementally, so gradually that each generation barely noticed the change. By the time of Diablo's invasion, the Zakharum Church was thoroughly corrupted at its highest levels. The common priests and believers were genuine, still following Akarat's original teachings. But the leadership, the inner council, they served Mephisto. They didn't even realize it. They thought they were doing holy work. Meanwhile, Tristram was founded. The kingdom of Kundurus established itself around this small town. It seemed insignificant at the time, just another human settlement in a world full of them. But Tristram sat above something important, ancient catacombs that connected to a buried cathedral. And beneath that cathedral, sealed away in the deepest vault, was a soul stone. The soul stones were heaven's solution to a problem. During one of the wars between heaven and hell, the Anguirus Council had managed to capture the primevals. Actually capture them, trap their essences. This was unprecedented. The primevals were fundamental forces of the burning hells. They couldn't be killed permanently, but they could be contained. The council created the soul stones specifically for this purpose. Crystallized angelic power, forged into prisons that could hold even the mightiest demons. They trapped Diablo, Mephisto, and Baal inside these stones, then buried them in remote locations across Sanctuary. They thought this would end the threat, keep the prime evils imprisoned forever. They were wrong. The soul stones could contain demonic essence, yes, but they couldn't prevent consciousness. Diablo, trapped in his stone, remained aware. He couldn't act directly, but he could influence. He could reach out to minds nearby, corrupt them slowly, prepare for his eventual escape. The cathedral above Diablo's prison was built by the Haradrim. This was a secret order of mages, founded by Tyrael himself. After the prime evils were imprisoned, Tyrael realized that heaven couldn't directly protect the soul stones without violating the binding, so he empowered humans to do it. The Haradrim were his chosen guardians. For generations they succeeded. The Haradrim were powerful, disciplined, incorruptible. They maintained the seals on the soul stones, monitored for any signs of demonic activity. They hunted down cults and demon worshippers. They were humanity's defense against hell's influence. But the Haradrim were human. They aged and died. Each new generation was slightly less knowledgeable than the last. The Order's power faded as the Nephilim blood in their veins grew thinner. By the time Tristram was founded, the Haradrim were a shadow of what they'd been. Deckard Cain was one of the last true Haradrim. Most people saw him as an eccentric old scholar, obsessed with ancient texts and forgotten prophecies. He wandered from town to town, studying ruins, translating dead languages. People humored him but didn't take him seriously. Cain knew better. He'd inherited the Haradrim's records, fragmentary as they were. He knew about the soul stones, he knew about the prisons beneath Sanctuary's oldest settlements, and he knew that the seals were weakening. The question wasn't if the primevals would escape, it was when. King Leoric claimed Tristram's throne with the best intentions. He was a good man, a just ruler. He moved his court there, established order, protected his people. He had no idea what lay beneath his new kingdom. The Zakarum Church encouraged his reign. They helped him consolidate power, offered spiritual guidance. He didn't know the church was corrupted, didn't know that one of his most trusted advisors, Archbishop Lazarus, was actually a demon worshipper. Didn't know that Lazarus had been drawn to Tristram specifically because of what was buried there. Lazarus discovered the cathedral. The sealed entrance had been hidden for centuries, but he found it. He descended into the catacombs, drawn by Diablo's call. The Lord of Terror had been imprisoned for so long, trapped in his soul stone, unable to do anything but whisper and wait. But now he had a tool, a corrupted priest with ambition and malice. Lazarus broke the seals, not all at once. That would have been too obvious. He weakened them gradually, performed rituals that eroded the angelic magic. He brought cultists down into the depths, sacrificed them to fuel dark magic. Each sacrifice weakened the prison a little more. Diablo began to manifest. Not physically, not yet. But his presence leaked out. His influence spread through Tristram like a plague. People began having nightmares. Animals grew aggressive. A sense of dread settled over the town that no one could explain. King Leoric was the first major victim. Diablo tried to possess him directly. The Lord of Terror reached out from his weakening prison, attempted to take control of the king's body. If he could possess Kanduras's ruler, he could use that position to spread chaos across the entire kingdom. But Leoric was stronger than Diablo expected. The king's will resisted. He couldn't expel Diablo's influence completely, but he could fight it. The result was madness. Leoric's personality fractured under the strain. He became paranoid, violent, seeing enemies everywhere. His court watched in horror as their just king transformed into a tyrant. Lazarus suggested a solution. The king's son, Prince Albrecht, should be sent away for safety, moved to a secure location where the growing madness in Tristram couldn't affect him. Leoric agreed, one of his last rational decisions. Lazarus took Albrecht into the cathedral, down into the catacombs, down to where Diablo waited. The boy was young, innocent, his will unformed, perfect for possession. Diablo abandoned Leoric's crumbling mind and poured himself into Albrecht instead. The possession was successful this time. Albrecht's body became Diablo's vessel, but it took time for the transformation to complete. Diablo's demonic essence had to fully merge with the human form, reshape it into something that could contain his power. The process was agonizing. Albrecht's screams echoed through the catacombs, but no one heard them except the demons that Lazarus had summoned to guard the ritual. Above, King Leoric's madness reached its peak. Without Diablo's direct influence, he didn't recover. The damage was done. He executed advisors on false charges. He declared war on neighboring kingdoms for imagined insults. His knights watched helplessly as their king destroyed everything he'd built. Eventually, they had no choice. Leoric had to be stopped. His own captain of the guard, Lacdanan, led a group of knights into the throne room. They tried to reason with him first, begged him to see sense. When that failed, they fought him. The battle was brief but brutal. Leoric died, cursing them all. But death wasn't the end. Lazarus had been preparing for this. He'd performed rituals throughout the castle, dark magic that would trap Leoric's spirit. The king's ghost rose, still mad, still believing himself the rightful ruler. He became the Skeleton King, an undead horror haunting his own throne room, killing anyone who entered. The kingdom of Kandaras collapsed. Without a king, without leadership, it fragmented. Nobles fled, soldiers deserted, the common people barricaded themselves in their homes, terrified of the horrors emerging from the cathedral. Tristram became a ghost town, populated only by the desperate and the damned. Beneath it all, Diablo continued his transformation. He drew power from the fear above, fed on the despair spreading through Tristram. His body changed, becoming more demonic with each passing day. Horns sprouted from Albrecht's skull. The boy's skin turned red and hardened into scales. His human features distorted into something monstrous. When the transformation completed, Diablo stood fully formed in the physical world for the first time in centuries. He was free, but he was also cautious. His brothers were still imprisoned. Hell itself was still bound by the binding. He couldn't just rampage across Sanctuary. He needed to be strategic, so he waited. He built his forces in the catacombs beneath Tristram. He corrupted more humans, created more demons from the souls of the damned. He sent his influence spreading through the region, preparing for the moment when he could make his move. The first hero who descended into those catacombs had no idea what they were walking into. They thought they were investigating a local problem. Monsters in an old cathedral, maybe bandits or cultists. A dangerous job, certainly, but nothing apocalyptic. They didn't know they were about to confront one of the prime evils, didn't know that the fate of Sanctuary itself would hinge on what happened in those depths. They just knew that Tristram needed help, and they were willing to provide it. The warrior who descended those cathedral stairs didn't look like someone who'd saved the world. They were scarred, tired, carrying weapons that had seen too much use. Maybe they were a rogue from the Sisters Guild, trained in the old ways of demon hunting. Maybe a sorcerer who'd studied at the academies of the East. Or perhaps just a fighter, someone who'd survived enough battles to know how to handle themselves in dark places. Whoever they weren't ready for what they found. The first levels weren't that unusual. Old crypts, stone corridors, undead creatures shambling through the darkness. Standard fare for anyone who'd cleared out cursed tombs before. The undead were aggressive but manageable. Skeletons that fell apart when you hit them hard enough. Zombies that moved slow and predictable. But the deeper they went, the worse it got. The architecture changed. The stone became older, carved with symbols that predated human civilization. The undead gave way to demons. Small ones at first, fallen ones, those little red creatures that attacked in swarms. Then bigger things, creatures with no names in human languages. Horrors that existed only in Hell's armies. The hero pushed forward. They had to. Turning back meant abandoning Tristram to whatever was happening here, and by this point, they'd seen enough to know that whatever was down here, it needed to be stopped. They found evidence of what had happened scattered through the levels. Archbishop Lazarus's journals describing his descent into madness. Notes about summoning rituals and blood sacrifices. References to someone called the Dark Lord, who would bring a new age to Sanctuary. They found Leoric's ghost in the deeper levels, still wearing his crown, still mad. The Skeleton King attacked on sight, convinced the hero was a traitor who'd betrayed his kingdom. The fight was brutal. Leoric retained some of his combat skill even in death, and his undead form made him harder to kill than any living opponent. But eventually, he fell. His ghost dispersed with a final curse, still insisting he'd done nothing wrong. The hero continued down, past the crypts, past the caves carved into the mountain beneath Tristram, into sections of the labyrinth that predated human construction entirely. These were Herodric halls, parts of the original prison complex that Tyrael's mages had built around Diablo's soulstone, and finally, deep in the 16th level of the labyrinth, they found him. Diablo stood in a massive chamber, surrounded by pentagrams drawn in blood. Albrecht's body was completely transformed now. Nothing human remained visible. The Lord of Terror was fully manifested, 12 feet tall, red scales covering his body, curved horns rising from his skull. His eyes burned with hellfire. The battle that followed became legend. The hero fought with everything they had: spells, weapons, potions, anything that might hurt a prime evil. Diablo was powerful, incredibly powerful, but he wasn't at full strength. The binding still constrained him. He couldn't access all the power he'd wielded before his imprisonment. And the hero was skilled. They'd fought their way through 16 levels of demons and undead. They'd learned, adapted, grown stronger with each challenge. They knew how to read Diablo's attacks, when to dodge, when to strike back. The fight lasted hours. Both combatants pushed to their absolute limits. The chamber itself started to collapse from the forces being unleashed. Stone cracked, fire scorched the ancient walls, blood soaked the floor. Finally, impossibly, Diablo fell. The Lord of Terror's body collapsed, the demonic essence within it dispersing. Albrecht's corrupted form lay still on the chamber floor. The hero stood over the body, exhausted, wounded, but alive. They'd done it. They'd killed one of the prime evils. But then they made a mistake that would doom everything they'd accomplished. Diablo's soul stone lay on the ground next to the body, the red crystal that had imprisoned the Lord of Terror for so long. It was cracked now, damaged by the battle. The hero could see Diablo's essence swirling inside it, trying to escape. The logical thing would have been to destroy it, shatter the stone completely, let Diablo's essence disperse. But the hero had learned about the soul stones during their journey, had read heraldic texts that explained their purpose. The stones were meant to contain demons, to keep them imprisoned. If they destroyed the stone, Diablo's essence would return to hell. He'd be able to reform there, rebuild his strength, eventually return to threaten Sanctuary again. But if the stone remained intact, if it could be repaired somehow, Diablo could be imprisoned forever. The hero decided to keep the stone, to take it somewhere safe, somewhere it could be properly secured. They'd find heraldic scholars who understood these artifacts, who could repair the cracks and ensure Diablo stayed trapped. But there was a problem. The soul stone was damaged, it was leaking. Diablo's essence was seeping out, slowly but constantly, and the hero, carrying the stone, was exposed to that essence every moment. They didn't notice at first. The corruption was subtle, just thoughts that seemed slightly off, paranoia that felt justified given what they'd been through, anger that seemed reasonable after everything they'd seen. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. Diablo's essence had infected them. Not a full possession like with Albrecht, but enough influence to guide their thoughts, to push them in certain directions. The hero made another decision then, a desperate, terrible decision. If they were already corrupted, if Diablo's essence was already inside them, maybe they could contain it themselves. Maybe they could become a prison for the Lord of Terror, use their own will to keep him trapped. They took the soul stone and drove it into their own forehead. The pain was indescribable. The stone fused with their skull, embedding itself directly into their brain. Diablo's essence flooded into them immediately, stronger now that it had a living host. The hero's consciousness was pushed aside, suppressed, as the Lord of Terror took control, but the hero fought back. They were strong, much stronger than Albrecht had been. Their will was hardened by years of combat, by the journey through the cathedral, by the battle with Diablo himself. They could resist, they could contain him. For a while, Diablo settled into his new prison, this human body that had defeated him. He was patient. He could wait. He'd spent decades trapped in a crystal prison. He could spend a few more years slowly corrupting this hero from within, turning them into a puppet, using them to accomplish what he needed. Because Diablo had a plan. His brothers were still imprisoned. Baal in the desert tomb where Tal Rasha had sacrificed himself. Mephisto in the temple city of Kurast, deep in the eastern jungles. If Diablo could free them, if the three prime evils could reunite, they could challenge the binding itself, could break the wards that kept hell separated from Sanctuary. The hero left Tristram, the soul stone burning in their forehead. They told no one what they'd done, couldn't admit the truth even to themselves. They headed east, drawn by compulsions they didn't fully understand, following a path that Diablo was laying out for them. Behind them, Tristram fell into complete ruin. With the cathedral's evil defeated, people should have returned. The kingdom should have started rebuilding. Instead, things got worse. Demons continued to spawn in the labyrinth below. The few remaining citizens disappeared one by one. Within months, Tristram was completely abandoned. The hero's journey east took them through territories that had been peaceful for centuries. Everywhere they went, corruption followed. Not obvious at first, just small things. Crops failing, livestock dying, people having nightmares. The hero didn't connect these events to their own presence, didn't realize they were carrying the source of the corruption inside their own skull. They crossed mountains and plains, passed through kingdoms that had never seen demonic activity. And in their wake, darkness spread. Cultists emerged in villages they'd passed through. Summoning circles appeared in barns and basements. People who'd been normal their entire lives suddenly started hearing voices, performing rituals, preparing for something they couldn't name. Diablo was seeding the world, using his corrupted host as a conduit, spreading his influence across the entire Western continent. Every step the hero took, every town they visited, became another point of infection, another place where hell's power could take root. The hero noticed some of this, couldn't help but notice. But Diablo's influence made them rationalize it. These were isolated incidents, coincidences. The world had always had evil in it. This was just bad luck, not their fault. Meanwhile, in hell itself, the lesser evils were taking notice. Diablo had escaped. Their brother, one of the prime evils, was loose in sanctuary again. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The binding should have prevented it, but somehow Diablo had found a way. The lesser evils convened: Asmodan, Lord of Sin, Belial, Lord of Lies, and the others who'd helped exile the prime evils in the first place. They'd thought they'd won, thought they'd secured Hell's throne for themselves. Now they faced the possibility that the prime evils might return, might reclaim their power. They couldn't directly intervene in Sanctuary. The binding prevented that, but they could send their own agents, their own demons, to try to stop Diablo's plan. Not out of any desire to help humanity, but to protect their own position in Hell's hierarchy. So while Diablo moved east using his corrupted hero as a vessel, Hell's armies moved as well. Different factions, different agendas, all converging on the same locations, the places where Baal and Mephisto were imprisoned. The hero reached the eastern deserts first, following instincts they didn't understand. Drawn by Diablo's will, they sought the tomb where Baal was imprisoned. They didn't know what they were looking for, didn't consciously understand their purpose. But Diablo knew. He could sense his brother, could feel the soul stone that contained Baal's essence buried somewhere in these endless sands. The desert kingdoms had their own problems. The bindings weakening had affected them too. Demons were appearing in greater numbers. Ancient tombs that had been sealed for centuries were opening. Monsters that had been myths were becoming real again. But the hero's arrival made everything worse. Diablo's presence acted like a beacon, drawing demons from across hell. The desert became a war zone almost overnight. Humans caught in the middle, demons fighting each other as much as fighting humans. And through it all, the corrupted hero pressed forward, searching for Baal's prison. They found it eventually, a massive tomb complex buried beneath the sand. The same tomb where Tal Rasha had merged himself with Baal's soul stone 2 centuries earlier. The entrance was guarded by ancient magic, wards placed by the Haradrim to prevent anyone from disturbing what lay within. But the hero had a prime evil inside them. Diablo's power burned through those wards like paper. The tomb opened, and inside, in the deepest chamber, they found Tal Rasha. The mage had been a man once, Tal Rasha, one of the greatest Haradrim, second only to Tyrael himself in the Order's hierarchy. When the Haradrim had captured Baal 2 centuries ago, they'd discovered something horrifying. The soul stone meant to contain him was damaged, cracked during the battle. A flawed soul stone couldn't hold a prime evil indefinitely. Baal would eventually break free. So Tal Rasha had volunteered for the impossible. He'd proposed binding Baal's soul stone directly to himself, using his own body and will as an additional prison. a living seal to reinforce what the cracked stone couldn't accomplish alone. The other Haradrim had protested. This meant eternal torment, consciousness trapped forever with a prime evil clawing at your mind. But Tal Rasha had insisted. Someone had to do it. Better him than risk Baal escaping and destroying everything they'd fought for. They'd performed the ritual, bound Baal's soul stone into Tal Rasha's chest, chained him in the deepest chamber of this tomb, sealed the complex with every ward and protection the Haradrim could devise, and there Tal Rasha had remained for 200 years, locked in constant battle with Baal's consciousness, preventing the demon from breaking free through sheer force of will. But wills can crack, especially when they've been under siege for centuries. The hero stood before what remained of Tal Rasha. The mage was barely recognizable as human anymore. His body was twisted, corrupted by 2 centuries of containing demonic essence. The soul stone embedded in his chest pulsed with sickly light, and his eyes, when they opened, held something that wasn't entirely Tal Rasha anymore. He spoke. The voice was layered, 2 beings talking at once. Tal Rasha's human tone underneath, and something deeper, more malevolent on top. He recognized what stood before him. Not the hero, but the presence within the hero. He recognized his brother. Diablo, Tal Rasha said, or maybe it was Baal using Tal Rasha's mouth. The distinction had become meaningless after 2 centuries of forced merger. You've come to free me. The hero didn't respond, couldn't respond. Diablo was in full control now, using his vessel's body like a puppet. The Dark Wanderer stepped forward, reached out toward the soul stone in Tal Rasha's chest. What happened next would haunt the survivors forever. They'd argue about it for years afterward, whether Diablo freed Baal or whether Baal had already broken free and was just waiting for his brother to arrive. Whether Tal Rasha had still been fighting at the end, or whether he'd been completely consumed centuries ago. The truth was probably somewhere in between. Tal Rasha's will had held for 200 years, longer than anyone had any right to expect. But the binding's weakening had affected his prison too. The wards had been failing, the soul stone's crack had been spreading, and Baal had been gaining ground in their endless mental battle, inch by agonizing inch. When Diablo's power touched the soul stone, it didn't break Baal's prison so much as it dissolved what remained of it. The last threads of Tal Rasha's resistance snapped, the soul stone shattered, and Baal emerged not as a disembodied essence, but as a fully realized demon, using Tal Rasha's corrupted body as his vessel. The transformation was grotesque. Tal Rasha's human form twisted and expanded, bones breaking and reforming, flesh rippling as Baal's true nature asserted itself. Within moments, nothing recognizable as human remained. Only Baal, Lord of Destruction, free for the first time in 2 centuries. The 2 brothers stood in that ancient tomb, 2 prime evils reunited. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Their minds touched, shared information faster than words could convey. Diablo showed Baal everything he'd learned, how the binding was failing, how Sanctuary was vulnerable, how their youngest brother Mephisto was imprisoned in the east, in the jungles of Kurast, and Baal understood immediately. This was their chance, not just to escape, but to win, to corrupt Sanctuary so thoroughly that heaven could never reclaim it, to secure humanity as hell's eternal servants. The plan formed between them in seconds. Mephisto was already working on his part. He'd been imprisoned in Kurast for the same 2 centuries, bound in his own soulstone, but unlike Baal, Mephisto's soulstone hadn't been cracked. His prison had held perfectly, until recently. The binding's weakening had given Mephisto an opening, not enough to break free completely, but enough to extend his influence beyond his immediate prison. And Mephisto, Lord of Hatred, was an expert at working through others. He'd spent decades corrupting the religious order that guarded him. The Zakharum Church had once been humanity's greatest defense against hell. Now it was hell's greatest tool. The church's leaders had been the first to fall. Mephisto had whispered to them in their prayers, twisted their faith into fanaticism, turned their devotion into obsession. They'd convinced themselves they were doing holy work even as they performed increasingly horrific acts. Human sacrifice disguised as religious ritual, torture justified as purification, conquest framed as spreading faith. The church's armies had spread across the eastern jungles, subjugating neighboring kingdoms in Zakharum's name. They'd built a theocratic empire, all of it secretly serving Mephisto's will. And at the heart of it all, in Kurast's grand temple, Mephisto remained imprisoned but increasingly powerful. His soul stone might be intact, but he'd corrupted so many souls in his vicinity that his influence extended for hundreds of miles. Diablo and Baal understood their roles. Baal would remain in the deserts, establishing a base of power, corrupting the region, preparing for the final phase of their plan. Diablo would continue east, would travel to Kurast, would free Mephisto from his prison, and then, with all three prime evils free and working in concert, they'd implement the true plan, the one they'd been developing for centuries, the one that would finally give hell permanent victory over heaven. But Diablo needed to abandon his current vessel first. The hero's body had served its purpose, had carried him across the continent, had allowed him to free Baal, but it was burning out. A human body can only contain a prime evil for so long before the strain destroys it. Diablo needed to return to his true form, needed to rebuild his power before the final confrontation. So, in that tomb beneath the desert, Diablo tore himself free from the Dark Wanderer's body. The hero, corrupted and consumed, finally died. Whatever had remained of the person who'd descended into Tristram's cathedral, who'd driven their sword into Diablo's soulstone, who'd made that terrible decision to contain the demon within themselves, was gone, destroyed by the very power they'd tried to contain. Diablo manifested in his true demonic form, smaller than he'd been before his imprisonment, weakened by centuries trapped in that soulstone, but still immensely powerful, still a prime evil. He and Baal made their plans, then separated, Baal to begin corrupting the desert kingdoms, Diablo to continue east toward Kurast. The hero's companions arrived too late. They'd been tracking the Dark Wanderer across the continent, always a step behind, watching the trail of corruption he left in his wake. They'd hoped to save him, to somehow extract Diablo's essence before it completely consumed him. But they were too late. They found the hero's body in Talrasha's tomb, discarded like a used tool, and they found evidence of what had happened, the shattered soulstone, the signs of Baal's emergence, the realization that they now faced not one but two prime evils. The group had grown during their journey east. More heroes had joined them, drawn by the spreading catastrophe. Warriors and mages, rogues and priests, each with their own reasons for fighting. Some sought revenge, others sought redemption. Some were just trying to survive in a world that seemed to be falling apart. They realized they couldn't stop what was already in motion. Baal was free. Diablo was heading for Kurast. The prime evil's plan, whatever it was already underway. But they could try to prevent the next phase, could try to stop Diablo from freeing Mephisto, could try to save Kurast from complete destruction. So they pursued, followed Diablo's trail east into the jungles. The landscape changed dramatically. The deserts gave way to tropical forests, dense vegetation, oppressive humidity. The ruins here were different too. Ancient civilizations had risen and fallen in these jungles, leaving behind temples and monuments slowly being reclaimed by nature. The Zakharum Church controlled this region, but their control was crumbling. The church's corruption had become too obvious to ignore. Even their own soldiers were beginning to question their orders, to recognize that something was terribly wrong with their leadership. Kurast itself was in chaos when the heroes arrived. The city had once been magnificent, a jewel of human civilization. Now it was a nightmare. The church's temple complex dominated the city center, a massive structure that pulsed with malevolent energy. The streets were filled with cultists, with demons, with corrupted church soldiers. Regular citizens hid in their homes or tried to flee the city entirely. Mephisto's influence was overwhelming here. You could feel it in the air, a weight of hatred so intense it made breathing difficult. The Lord of Hatred had been imprisoned here for 2 centuries, and his proximity had poisoned everything. The city's population had been subjected to his influence for generations. Hatred had become normalized, casual cruelty accepted, violence justified. The heroes fought their way through the city. Each step closer to the temple complex brought them deeper into Mephisto's sphere of influence. They could feel his power trying to corrupt them, whispering suggestions, amplifying every negative emotion. Old grudges between party members surfaced, Paranoia grew, trust eroded. This was Mephisto's specialty. He didn't attack directly. He turned his enemies against each other, made them destroy themselves. But the heroes had one advantage. They'd been fighting demonic corruption for months now. They'd developed resistance, learned to recognize the whispers in their minds for what they were. They pushed forward despite the psychological assault, despite every instinct screaming at them to turn back. The temple complex was a maze of corridors and chambers, each more corrupted than the last. The church's priests had become monsters, barely human anymore, their devotion twisted into something demonic. They fought not as soldiers but as fanatics, throwing themselves at the heroes with suicidal rage. Deeper in the temple, reality itself became unstable. Mephisto's power was warping the physical space, creating impossible geometries, overlapping dimensions. Demons poured through tears in reality. The boundaries between hell and sanctuary were paper-thin here. At the heart of the complex, they found Mephisto's prison. Like Talrasha's tomb, it had been designed by the Haradrim 2 centuries ago. Unlike Talrasha's prison, this one hadn't required a human sacrifice. Mephisto's soul stone was intact, properly functioning. He'd been contained completely, unable to escape. But he'd been corrupting his surroundings the entire time. The Zakharum priests who'd guarded his prison had been his first victims, then their successors, then their successors. Generation after generation, each one slightly more corrupted than the last, until the entire church had become hell's unwitting servants. And now Diablo had arrived to finish what Mephisto had started. The Lord of Terror materialized in the chamber, his presence overwhelming. The heroes realized they were facing both prime evils at once. Mephisto trapped but immensely powerful, Diablo free and fully manifested. The battle was desperate. The heroes threw everything they had at the two demons, knowing this might be their last chance to stop Hell's plan. Diablo and Mephisto together in one place. This was supposed to be impossible. The entire plan of imprisoning the prime evils had been to keep them separated, to prevent them from combining their powers. Now 2 of the 3 stood before the heroes, and the chamber itself seemed barely able to contain their presence. Mephisto couldn't leave his prison, but that didn't make him less dangerous. His soul stone was intact, properly functioning, keeping him bound. But 2 centuries of imprisonment had given him time to extend his influence in other ways. The entire temple complex was an extension of his will now. The walls themselves pulsed with hatred, the air burned with it. Diablo had no such constraints. He was fully manifested, completely free, and he'd grown stronger since the heroes had last faced him. Absorbing the souls of countless demons and humans along his journey east had fed his power. He was larger now, more terrible, radiating such intense fear that even veteran warriors felt their courage falter. The battle began before the heroes could fully prepare themselves. Diablo struck first, his claws raking across enchanted armor like it was paper. Mephisto attacked from his prison, hurling bolts of pure hatred that burned worse than any fire. The heroes scattered, trying to avoid being caught between the 2 demons. Fighting 2 prime evils simultaneously required perfect coordination. Every member of the party had to know where everyone else was at all times. One mistake, one moment of poor positioning, and they'd be caught between demonic attacks with no escape. The paladin took point against Diablo, his blessed shield absorbing blows that would have killed lesser warriors. His auras provided some protection against the overwhelming fear, enough that his companions could function. But even he could feel his faith being tested. The Lord of Terror's presence was designed to break even the strongest minds. The sorceress focused on Mephisto, launching spell after spell at his prison. She couldn't destroy the soul stone that required specific rituals and tools they didn't have, but she could disrupt his concentration, force him to defend himself rather than attacking freely. The others divided their attention between the 2 demons, striking when they saw openings, defending when necessary. It was a desperate dance, constantly moving, never standing still long enough for either prime evil to land a devastating blow. Mephisto's attacks were psychological as much as physical. He amplified every negative emotion. The barbarian felt his battle rage twisting into mindless fury. The Amazon's determination became rigid stubbornness. The necromancer's scholarly detachment warped into cold indifference toward his companions. Each of them had to fight not just the demons, but their own corrupted emotions. Diablo used terror as a weapon. He made them see things that weren't there, made shadows seem like threats, made safety feel like a trap. The chamber became a nightmare landscape where nothing could be trusted. Walls that seemed solid weren't. Floors that appeared stable gave way. Reality itself became unreliable. But the heroes had been preparing for this moment since Tristram. Every demon they'd fought, every corrupted region they'd cleansed, every soul they'd saved had been training for this confrontation. They'd learned to recognize demonic influence, to resist corruption, to fight through fear and hatred. Slowly, painfully, they gained ground. The paladin's shield work kept Diablo occupied, preventing the Lord of Terror from unleashing his full power. The sorceress's constant magical assault forced Mephisto to focus on defense. The others exploited every opening, landing blow after blow. Diablo was the first to fall. Not killed, demons couldn't truly die outside hell, but forced back. His physical form shattered under the combined assault, his essence retreating toward his soul stone. But something went wrong. The gem that had once contained him was damaged, cracked from its time embedded in Aiden's flesh. When Diablo's essence tried to return to it, the soul stone couldn't fully contain him. Part of Diablo's power dispersed, fled east toward Kurast's docks. The heroes realized with horror that the Lord of Terror was heading for the ships in the harbor. He was continuing his journey, still pursuing whatever plan had brought him to Kurast in the first place. But they couldn't pursue him yet. Mephisto remained, and leaving the Lord of Hatred unchecked would doom Kurast. The heroes turned their full attention to the imprisoned demon. Without Diablo to divide their focus, they could coordinate a proper assault. Mephisto's prison had weakened over 2 centuries, not enough for him to escape, but enough that his influence leaked through constantly. The Haradrim who'd built it would have been horrified to see how degraded it had become. The magical bindings were frayed, the physical structure was crumbling, the soul stone itself showed signs of corruption. The heroes attacked the prison directly, not trying to destroy it, that would only free Mephisto completely. Instead, they reinforced the bindings, used every protective spell and prayer they knew to strengthen what remained of the Haradrim's work. It was like trying to repair a dam while water poured through. Every breach they sealed, 2 more appeared. Mephisto fought back with everything he had. He'd spent 200 years corrupting this temple, turning it into an extension of himself. Now he used that connection, made the walls attack, made the floor open into pits, made the ceiling collapse. The entire structure was his weapon. The battle became a race. Could they reinforce the prison before the temple destroyed them? Could they contain Mephisto before his hatred consumed everything? The heroes pushed themselves beyond their limits, drawing on reserves of strength they didn't know they had. The necromancer called on the spirits of uncorrupted Zakharum priests, the ones who died fighting Mephisto's influence. Their ghosts appeared, hundreds of them, adding their power to the reinforcement. The paladin channeled every blessing he'd ever learned, every prayer, every holy verse. The sorceress wove spells of binding so complex they would have taken months to prepare under normal circumstances. Gradually, impossibly, it worked. The prison stabilized, the magical bindings strengthened. Mephisto's influence began to recede, pulled back into his soul stone. The Lord of Hatred raged, screamed promises of vengeance, but he was contained once more. The temple stopped shaking. The walls returned to normal. The oppressive weight of hatred that had hung over Kurast for 2 centuries lifted slightly. Not gone, Mephisto was still imprisoned beneath the city. But contained properly now, his corruption checked. The heroes collapsed, exhausted beyond anything they'd experienced before. They'd just fought 2 prime evils and survived, but there was no time to rest. Diablo had escaped, was heading east. Whatever his plan was, whatever had driven him to journey across the world, he was still pursuing it. From the harbor they heard screams. Diablo had reached the ships. The Lord of Terror was commandeering a vessel, forcing the crew to sail him further east. The heroes realized they had to follow, had to finish this. If Diablo completed his plan, everything they'd accomplished would be meaningless. But first, they needed to secure Mephisto's prison. The Zakharum church was in chaos. The priests who'd been corrupted without realizing it were devastated when they understood what they'd become. Some fell to madness, others begged for forgiveness. A few tried to flee, unable to face what they'd done. The heroes worked with the few uncorrupted priests who remained to establish new guards for Mephisto's prison. Proper guards this time, rotated frequently, monitored constantly, with safeguards to detect corruption before it could spread. It wasn't perfect. Nothing involving a primeval's prison could be perfect. But it was better than what had existed before. The city itself would take years to recover. Mephisto's influence had seeped into every aspect of Kurast society. The casual cruelty, the normalized hatred, the acceptance of violence, all of that would persist long after the demon was properly contained. Cultural corruption doesn't disappear just because its source is removed, but at least now there was hope. The people of Kurast could begin healing. The church could be reformed. The city could rebuild on a foundation that wasn't poisoned from the start. The heroes requisitioned a ship. The captain protested, said the Eastern Ocean was cursed, that no ship returned from those waters. But the heroes insisted. They'd tracked Diablo across the entire continent. They weren't stopping now. As they sailed east, following Diablo's trail, they learned more about what lay ahead. The captain, once he accepted that this voyage was happening regardless of his objections, shared what little he knew. Beyond the Eastern Ocean lay a group of islands, ancient islands older than Kurast, older perhaps than any human civilization. The islands were shrouded in mystery and legend. Some sailors spoke of a fortress there, built by beings that predated humanity. Others mentioned strange energy surrounding the islands, something that made navigation impossible for normal ships. A few whispered about the World Stone itself, the artifact that had been used to create Sanctuary in the first place. The heroes began to understand Diablo's plan. The Lord of Terror wasn't just fleeing. He was heading for the World Stone, the artifact that defined the boundaries between heaven, hell, and sanctuary. If he could corrupt it, could twist its power to hell's purposes, he could unmake sanctuary itself, could transform the entire world into an extension of hell. This was bigger than they'd realized, bigger than one city or one kingdom. Diablo was threatening the fundamental structure of reality. If he succeeded, there would be nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. Sanctuary itself would cease to exist. The voyage took weeks. The Eastern Ocean was rough, filled with storms that seemed almost alive. More than once, the ship nearly capsized. The crew whispered that the storms were trying to drive them back, that the islands themselves didn't want visitors. But the heroes pressed on. They'd come too far to turn back now. They'd defeated Andariel, rescued Deckard Cain, destroyed the corrupted monastery. They'd stopped Duriel, prevented Baal's release, saved Tal Rasha's tomb from total corruption. They'd fought both Diablo and Mephisto in the same battle and survived. They would finish this, would stop Diablo before he could corrupt the World Stone, would save Sanctuary one final time. They had to, because if they failed here, everything ended. Not just their quest, not just their lives, but the entire world. Every person they'd saved, every village they'd protected, every demon they'd banished. It would all mean nothing if Diablo succeeded. The islands appeared on the horizon after a particularly brutal storm. They were volcanic, covered in jungle, surrounded by waters that churned with unnatural energy. The captain refused to go closer, said his ship wouldn't survive the approach. The heroes would have to find another way to reach shore. They spotted a smaller vessel, abandoned on a nearby beach. It had belonged to Diablo's ship, the one he'd commandeered in Kurast. The Lord of Terror had reached the islands ahead of them, was probably already inside whatever fortress or structure housed the World Stone. The heroes prepared themselves for what would surely be their final confrontation. They checked their weapons, reinforced their armor, reviewed their strategies. They knew this battle would be different from all the others. Diablo would be at his most powerful here, close to the World Stone, and he wouldn't be alone. The smaller vessel was barely seaworthy, but it got them to shore. The beach was black volcanic sand, hot enough to burn through worn boots. The jungle beyond looked wrong. Trees twisted in impossible directions, vines moved when no wind blew, and the air shimmered with heat that had nothing to do with temperature. They found Diablo's trail immediately. The Lord of Terror hadn't bothered hiding his path. Why would he? He knew they were coming, probably wanted them to follow. This was going to be a trap, but what choice did they have? Turn back, let him corrupt the world stone unopposed? The jungle gave way to ancient stairs carved into the mountainside. The stairs were older than anything the heroes had seen before, older than Talrash's tomb, older than Kurast's temples. The stone was covered in symbols that predated human language, markings left by the beings who'd created Sanctuary in the first place. Climbing those stairs felt like moving backward through time. Each step took them deeper into history, closer to the foundation of the world. The air grew thinner but somehow heavier, charged with energy that made their skin prickle. At the summit they found it, Mount Ariyat, the sacred mountain, and carved into its peak, a fortress so ancient it looked like it had grown from the mountain itself. This was the World Stone Keep. Guards stood at the entrance, but these weren't demons, they were barbarians, warriors of the northern tribes who'd sworn an oath to protect the World Stone. Except something was wrong with them. Their eyes were empty, their movements mechanical. They'd been corrupted, turned into mindless puppets. The heroes didn't want to fight them. These were victims, not enemies, but the corrupted barbarians attacked without hesitation, and there was no way to reach them, no way to break whatever hold Diablo had over them. The battles were quick and brutal. Each fallen barbarian was a tragedy, another innocent twisted by hell's influence. Inside the fortress, the corruption was everywhere. The walls pulsed with red energy. The floor was slick with something that wasn't quite blood. The air tasted of sulfur and decay. Diablo had been thorough. Every chamber, every hallway showed signs of his influence. They fought through waves of demons, the same types they'd faced before, but stronger here, empowered by their proximity to the World Stone. Fallen ones that exploded with fire, goatmen that moved faster than should be possible, and new creatures too, things that had been summoned specifically for this defense. The fortress was a maze, deliberately designed to confuse and disorient. Passages doubled back on themselves. Rooms seemed to shift when you weren't looking. It would have been easy to get lost, to wander until exhaustion claimed them. But they kept moving forward, kept following the trail of corruption that led deeper into the mountain. They found more corrupted barbarians as they descended. Some fought, others had simply died where they stood, unable to resist Diablo's influence but refusing to serve him. Their bodies lined the halls, silent testament to the cost of this invasion. Finally, they reached the throne room, a massive chamber at the heart of the fortress, where the leaders of the barbarian tribes would gather to discuss threats to the World Stone. Now it was filled with demons, and at the center stood Baal. Not Tal Rasha, not the possessed mage. This was Baal himself, freed completely from his prison. Diablo had done it somehow, had finished what Duriel started. The Lord of Destruction stood in his true form, massive and terrible, his body a nightmare of chitin and flame. The battle was chaos. Baal didn't just attack, he remade reality around him. The floor turned to ice, then lava, then back to stone. Clones of himself appeared and vanished. Tentacles erupted from nowhere. He could teleport across the room, could summon demons mid-battle, could cast curses that drained life and mana simultaneously. The heroes adapted as best they could. They'd learned from every previous battle, had developed tactics for the unexpected. They spread out, prevented Baal from targeting them all at once. They prioritized his clones, figured out which was real. They dodged the tentacles, resisted the curses, survived the elemental transformations. It took everything they had, every potion, every spell, every ounce of skill they'd accumulated. But eventually, impossibly, Baal fell. His body dissolved into ash and screaming shadows, pulled back to hell in pieces. But there was no time to celebrate, because beyond the throne room they could feel it. The World Stone itself pulsing with corrupted energy. Diablo had reached it first, was already working his corruption into its structure. They ran through the final passages, down stairs that seemed to descend forever, until they reached the World Stone chamber. It was massive, carved from the living rock of the mountain, and at its center floated the World Stone itself. It looked like a massive crystal, but it wasn't solid. Energy swirled inside it, patterns of light and dark that defined the boundaries of Sanctuary. Heaven and hell were kept separate here, prevented from fully manifesting in the mortal realm. This artifact maintained the balance, kept Sanctuary independent, and wrapped around it like a parasite was Diablo. The Lord of Terror had grown since Kurast. Fed by Mephisto's essence, Empowered by his proximity to the World Stone, he was enormous. His form barely looked humanoid anymore. He was all horns and claws and burning eyes, a concentration of terror given physical shape. He turned as they entered, and his laughter shook the chamber. Not because he was amused, but because he'd won. The corruption was already spreading through the World Stone. They could see it, red veins spreading through the crystal like infection. Even if they killed Diablo here, the damage was done. The final battle began. Diablo used everything, lightning that arced across the entire chamber, walls of fire that trapped them in corners, the bone prison that had killed so many in the past. He summoned demons constantly, using them as shields and weapons, and worst of all, he could manipulate the World Stone itself, using its power to reshape reality in the chamber. Gravity would reverse, time would slow, the walls would close in. The heroes fought not just Diablo, but the environment itself, every law of physics becoming a weapon in the Lord of Terror's hands. They died. Multiple times they died, but each time they returned, because they'd learned something crucial over their long journey. Death wasn't the end for them anymore. They'd absorbed too much energy from the demons they'd killed, had become something more than human. They could return, could keep fighting, as long as their will held, and their will held. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time didn't work properly in the World Stone chamber, but gradually, impossibly, they gained ground. Diablo's attacks became less coordinated. His control over the World Stone faltered. The corruption stopped spreading, began to recede. With a final coordinated assault, they struck Diablo's core. Every weapon, every spell, every ounce of remaining strength, all focused on the Lord of Terror's heart. The crystal around them cracked, the air itself screamed, and Diablo fell. His body exploded into shadow and flame, torn apart by forces beyond mortal understanding. The Lord of Terror was banished, sent back to hell in pieces so scattered it would take ages to reform. The immediate threat was over, but as the echoes of battle faded, they realized the truth. The corruption had stopped spreading, but it hadn't been removed. The World Stone was damaged, not destroyed, but changed. The boundaries between heaven, hell, and sanctuary were weakening. A figure appeared in the chamber, Tyrael, the Archangel of Justice. He'd been watching, waiting, unable to directly intervene, but ready to act when needed. And now, looking at the corrupted World Stone, he made a decision. The World Stone couldn't be saved. The corruption was too deep, too fundamental. If left alone, it would continue spreading, would eventually tear down all barriers between realms. Hell would flood into Sanctuary unopposed. There was only one option. Tyrael raised his sword, Eldruin, the blade that had been forged in Heaven's foundries. With a single strike, he shattered the World Stone completely. The explosion was cataclysmic. The entire mountain shook. The fortress above began to collapse. Reality itself seemed to crack. Tyrael teleported the heroes away, saved them from the destruction. When they materialized outside, miles from Mount Ariat, they turned back to watch. The mountain was falling, not eroding or crumbling, but falling into itself, collapsing into the void where the World Stone had been. The sacred mountain, the anchor point of Sanctuary, was gone, and with it the old rules were gone too. The barriers that had protected Sanctuary from direct divine intervention were removed. Heaven and hell could now manifest more easily in the mortal realm. The age of heroes and demons was ending. The age of angels and greater devils was beginning. The heroes stood together, watching the destruction of everything they'd fought to protect. They'd won every battle but lost the war. Sanctuary was saved from immediate corruption, but its fundamental nature had changed. The world would never be the same. Tyrael appeared beside them, his sword still glowing with the power of the strike that had destroyed the World Stone. He explained what would come next. Heaven would take a more active role in protecting Sanctuary. Hell would launch more direct invasions. The balance was broken, and a new equilibrium would have to be found. But that was a problem for the future. For now, the immediate threat was ended. Diablo was banished, Baal was defeated, Mephisto was destroyed. The prime evil's plan to corrupt Sanctuary had failed. The heroes had saved the world. Even if that world was forever changed, they returned to civilization, to the people they'd protected, though those people would never fully understand what had been sacrificed. The heroes were celebrated, called saviors, offered positions of honor and power, but they knew the truth. They'd done what was necessary, but necessary isn't the same as good. Sanctuary survived, but at what cost? The world stone was gone, the barriers were down, the protection that had allowed humanity to develop independently, free from direct divine meddling, was removed. Humanity's age of innocence, brief as it was, had ended. Standing at the edge of a rebuilt town looking toward where Mount Ariat had stood, one of the heroes asked the question they'd all been thinking. Had they made the right choice? Pursuing Diablo across the world, forcing this confrontation, leading to the destruction of the World Stone? Tyrael, still present, answered honestly. There were no right choices, only necessary ones. If they'd done nothing, Diablo would have corrupted the World Stone slowly, achieved the same result, but with Hell in control. By forcing the confrontation, they'd at least kept that power out of demonic hands. Small comfort, but it was something. The heroes eventually parted ways. Their quest was done. The world had changed. They had changed. They'd started as simple adventurers, seeking fortune and glory. They'd become something else. Legends, heroes, survivors of a war that had reshaped reality itself. Years would pass, decades. The world would adapt to its new reality. Heaven and hell would continue their eternal conflict, now fought more openly on sanctuary soil. New heroes would rise, new threats would emerge, the cycle would continue, as it always had, as it always would. But on quiet nights, in taverns across sanctuary, people would tell stories about the heroes who defeated the primevals, who saved the world even as they doomed it to change, who faced the lords of hell and survived. And somewhere, in hell's twisted depths, Diablo stirred, banished but not destroyed, scattered but slowly reforming, because terror is eternal. It can't be killed, only delayed. The Lord of Terror would return. Maybe not in this age, maybe not for centuries, but eventually, inevitably, terror would walk sanctuary again. That's the nature of darkness. You can fight it, you can push it back, you can win battles and save lives, but you can never truly eliminate it. The best you can do is stand against it when it rises, hold the line, protect what matters, and hope that when you fall, someone else will pick up the fight. The story of Diablo ends here, but the story of Sanctuary continues, number 9 of 9. The heroes eventually parted ways, their quest was done, the world had changed, they had changed. They'd started as simple adventurers, seeking fortune and glory. They'd become something else, legends, heroes, survivors of a war that had reshaped reality itself. Years would pass, decades, the world would adapt to its new reality. Heaven and hell would continue their eternal conflict, now fought more openly on sanctuary soil. New heroes would rise, new threats would emerge. The cycle would continue, as it always had, as it always would. But on quiet nights in taverns across sanctuary, people would tell stories about the heroes who defeated the primevals, who saved the world even as they doomed it to change, who faced the lords of hell and survived. And somewhere, in hell's twisted depths, Diablo stirred, banished but not destroyed, scattered but slowly reforming. Because terror is eternal, it can't be killed, only delayed. The Lord of Terror would return. Maybe not in this age, maybe not for centuries, but eventually, inevitably, terror would walk sanctuary again. That's the nature of darkness. You can fight it, you can push it back, you can win battles and save lives, but you can never truly eliminate it. The best you can do is stand against it when it rises, hold the line, protect what matters, and hope that when you fall, someone else will pick up the fight. So that's the complete story of Diablo, from Anu tearing itself apart at the beginning of creation, through the eternal conflict between heaven and hell, to the creation of Sanctuary and the Nephilim, all the way to the destruction of the World Stone and everything that came after. It's a story about cycles, about how the same conflicts repeat across different ages with different players but the same fundamental tensions, light versus dark, order versus chaos, heaven versus hell, and caught in the middle, humanity, descendants of both angels and demons, trying to forge their own path. The tragedy of it is that no one really wins. The angels fight for eternal order, but can't achieve it because change is fundamental to existence. The demons fight for eternal chaos, but hell itself has hierarchies and rules, and humans, who should be able to transcend both, keep getting pulled into conflicts that predate their existence. Anu started this whole thing by trying to achieve perfection through separation, tried to split good from evil, order from chaos. That single act created everything that followed: the eternal conflict, the corruption of sanctuary, the rise and fall of civilizations. All of it traces back to that moment when one being decided it couldn't exist as a unified whole. There's something almost sad about that. The entire universe, all the suffering and struggle, all the heroism and sacrifice exists because one cosmic entity couldn't accept its own complexity, couldn't live with containing both light and dark. The Nephilim represent what could have been, beings that naturally contain both angelic and demonic essence, that could have existed as unified wholes rather than being torn between extremes. But they were suppressed, weakened, reduced to humanity, and humanity inherited that same struggle, that same inability to reconcile their dual nature. Every human carries fragments of the dark soul within them, but they also carry the potential for angelic virtue. They're capable of both terrible evil and incredible good. That's not a flaw. That's what makes them interesting, what gives them genuine choice. But it's also what makes them vulnerable to corruption from both sides. The heroes who defeated the prime evils weren't special because they were purely good. They were special because they could resist corruption while still using power from questionable sources. They worked with angels but didn't blindly trust them. They fought demons but understood that hell's power could be turned against itself. They existed in the grey areas that beings of pure light or pure darkness couldn't navigate. That's probably the real lesson of Diablo's story. Purity is impossible and probably not even desirable. The pursuit of absolute good leads to the same problems as the pursuit of absolute evil. Both require eliminating nuance, crushing complexity, reducing everything to simple binaries. Sanctuary survived not because of angelic intervention or demonic corruption, but because humans kept making complicated choices in complicated situations. They failed sometimes, they made mistakes, they caused as many problems as they solved, but they kept trying, kept adapting, kept finding new ways to deal with ancient conflicts. The destruction of the World Stone was both an ending and a beginning. The old protections were gone, yes, but those protections had also been limitations. Humanity was forced to develop under specific constraints, prevented from reaching their full potential. With the World Stone destroyed, those limits were removed. Whether that's good or bad depends on what humanity does with their freedom. They could become powerful enough to stand as equals with angels and demons, or they could destroy themselves trying. The potential goes both ways. Tyrael's decision to shatter the World Stone was the ultimate acknowledgement that sometimes you can't save something by preserving it. Sometimes the only way forward is to destroy what's broken and rebuild. It's not a happy solution. It's not even a good solution. But it was the only solution that didn't result in Sanctuary's complete corruption. That's war, really. Not the glorious battles or heroic sacrifices, but the ugly necessity of choosing between bad options. The heroes didn't want to destroy the World Stone. They wanted to save it, restore it, return things to how they were. But that wasn't possible. So they made the choice that would at least prevent hell from winning completely. Decades later, when the immediate crisis had passed and people could look back with some perspective, historians would debate whether the heroes were actually heroes at all. They'd caused as much destruction as they prevented. The world they saved was fundamentally different from the world they'd set out to protect. Was that success or failure? The heroes themselves probably didn't know. They'd done what they thought was necessary. They'd fought when fighting was required. They'd made impossible choices because someone had to. Whether that made them heroes or just survivors was a question they'd leave for others to answer. What's certain is that Sanctuary continued. Humans kept building civilizations, kept having children, kept trying to create meaning in a world that often seemed meaningless. They knew now that angels and demons were real, that their world sat between heaven and hell, that cosmic forces had shaped their existence, but they lived anyway. Because that's what life is, continuing despite uncertainty, building despite knowing everything eventually falls, loving despite loss, creating despite destruction. The universe might be the product of cosmic dysfunction, but that doesn't make human experiences less valid or less important. The stories people told in those taverns, the legends that grew around the heroes who defeated the primevals, those weren't really about the battles or the demons. They were about the human capacity to face overwhelming odds and keep fighting, about ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances who somehow found the strength to persevere. Every person who heard those stories took something different from them. Some heard tales of glory and sought to become heroes themselves. Others heard warnings about the cost of ambition. Some found comfort in knowing that darkness could be defeated, even temporarily. Others recognized the tragedy of how much had to be sacrificed for even partial victory. All of those interpretations were valid. That's the thing about mythology, about stories that survive through generations. They contain enough complexity that different people can find different meanings. The story of Diablo isn't just one narrative, but dozens, depending on which parts you focus on and what questions you bring to it. Is it a story about the danger of trying to separate good from evil? About the cost of cosmic conflicts on mortal lives? About the resilience of humanity in the face of divine and infernal interference? About the corruption of power? About the necessity of sacrifice? About the failure of institutions? About the triumph of individual heroism? Yes, all of those, and more. The Diablo universe doesn't offer simple answers because the questions it raises are fundamentally complicated. How do you fight evil without becoming evil? How do you maintain hope in the face of cosmic indifference? How do you preserve what's worth preserving while accepting necessary change? How do you live a meaningful life in a universe that might be meaningless? These aren't questions with clear solutions. They're tensions to be navigated, balances to be maintained. Every generation has to find their own answers, make their own choices, face their own demons, both literal and metaphorical. The cycle continues. It always continues. Diablo will return someday. Maybe not in the same form, maybe not with the same plan, but terror is eternal. Mephisto's hatred, Baal's destruction, all the forces of hell will rise again. They have to. That's their nature. But humanity will rise to face them again too. New heroes will emerge. New choices will be made. The eternal conflict will continue playing out on Sanctuary's soil. That's not pessimism. It's just recognition that struggle is ongoing, that there's no final victory that solves everything forever. What matters is how you respond in the moment, whether you stand or run when darkness comes, whether you help others or only yourself, whether you maintain your humanity in inhuman circumstances. The big cosmic forces will do what they do. Your choices happen in the small moments, in individual decisions that might seem insignificant, but that accumulate into who you are. The heroes who saved Sanctuary weren't born heroes. They became heroes through a series of choices, each one building on the last. They could have turned back at any point, could have decided the cost was too high, the enemy too strong, the odds too impossible. They kept going anyway. That's what heroism actually looks like. Not destiny or prophecy or special powers, though those things can help. Heroism is choosing to act when you could choose to hide. It's continuing when you want to quit. It's standing up when it would be easier to stay down. Everyone faces those choices, not just legendary warriors fighting primevals. Every person encounters moments where they can choose courage or fear, compassion or indifference, action or passivity. The scale might be different, but the fundamental decision is the same. What kind of person do you want to be? Sanctuary's story suggests that perfection is impossible and probably not worth pursuing. Anu tried to achieve it and created millennia of conflict. Inarius tried to achieve it and damned his own creation. Gwyn tried to achieve it and doomed countless souls to become lords of Cinder. The pursuit of absolute purity, absolute order, absolute anything tends to cause more problems than it solves. What works is messy compromise, accepting that you contain both light and dark, that you're capable of both good and evil, that life is complicated and choices are rarely clear. The Nephilim were powerful because they embraced their dual nature rather than trying to suppress half of it. Humanity's strength comes from the same place, from accepting complexity rather than demanding simplicity. This doesn't mean moral relativism, doesn't mean all choices are equally valid. Fighting to protect people is better than killing them for power. Resisting corruption is better than embracing it. Some things are worth defending, some lines are worth holding. But the way you defend those things matters. The methods you use shape you as much as the goals you pursue. The heroes could have used hell's power to defeat hell, could have justified any atrocity in the name of victory. They didn't. They maintained their humanity even while fighting inhuman enemies. That restraint, that refusal to become what they fought, was as important as any battle they won. As you lie there listening to this, maybe falling asleep, maybe still awake, the story of Diablo offers something to consider. Not answers, but perspectives, ways of thinking about conflict and choice and the meaning we create in an indifferent universe. Your life probably doesn't involve fighting literal demons or confronting primevals, but you face your own struggles, your own dark forces, your own impossible choices. The specifics are different, but the fundamental challenges are similar. How do you keep going when everything seems hopeless? How do you maintain integrity when compromise is easier? How do you find meaning in a world that doesn't hand it to you? The characters in this story figured it out by doing, not by having perfect understanding. They made mistakes, they failed sometimes, they questioned their choices, but they kept moving forward, kept trying to do what seemed right, even when right wasn't clear. That's probably the most human thing about them. Not their eventual victory, but their willingness to try despite uncertainty. Their refusal to give up even when giving up would have been understandable. Their determination to matter in a universe that suggested nothing matters. Because here's the thing the story implies but doesn't state directly. Meaning isn't something you find, it's something you create. The universe might not care about human struggles, but humans care. And that caring, that decision to treat things as meaningful, makes them meaningful, at least to us, and maybe that's enough. Sanctuary exists because beings decided to create it. It survives because people choose to defend it. The heroes matter because they chose to act. None of it was predetermined or cosmically ordained. It happened because individuals made choices, and those choices accumulated into something larger. You're making choices too, every day, every moment. Most of them seem small, insignificant, but they add up. They shape who you are and who you become. The story of Diablo suggests that those choices matter, even if no one's keeping score, even if there's no cosmic judgment tallying your successes and failures. So what do you do with that? You keep going. You make the best choices you can with the information you have. You help people when you can. You resist corruption when it appears. You maintain your humanity in whatever circumstances you face. You create meaning through your actions and your relationships and your refusal to give up. That's the real victory. Not defeating evil once and for all, because that's impossible, but choosing to stand against it when it appears. Choosing to be someone who makes things slightly better rather than worse. Choosing to matter in whatever small ways you can. The eternal conflict continues, in sanctuary, in the real world, in your own life. Light and dark, order and chaos, hope and despair. These forces will always be in tension. The question isn't how to resolve that tension permanently. The question is how you navigate it today. And that's where we'll leave it, with sanctuary changed but surviving, with humanity facing an uncertain future but facing it nonetheless, with heroes who saved the world at great cost and then had to live with the consequences, with the understanding that victory is temporary, struggle is ongoing, and meaning is what you make of it. The complete story of Diablo, from the beginning of creation to the breaking of the world's stone. From Anu's self-destruction to humanity's survival. From cosmic forces to individual choices. It's been a long journey, and if you're still here, still listening, thanks for coming along. Rest well. The darkness will return, as it always does, but so will the light, and so will people willing to stand between them, making impossible choices, creating meaning in an indifferent universe, proving that even in a world shaped by cosmic dysfunction, human courage and compassion and determination matter. That's enough. It has to be, because it's all we have. And somehow, impossibly, it's been enough so far. Maybe it'll keep being enough. We'll find out together.